Let us begin. Today, we mourn the passing of Brandon Mull, cherished author of 17 New York Times best-selling novels. But those closest to Brandon knew him as a devoted husband and beloved father. Rest assured that Brandon Mull is in a better place, gone to that hidden pond in the sky.
Hey, I heard my name. What's going on? Why is everyone dressed in black?
We're having your funeral.
But I'm not dead.
You're supposed to be dead.
But he's clearly not. Hi, sweetie.
Maybe he came back from the dead.
No, I never died. What gave you that idea?
The news said you were stomped on by a giant and flattened like a pancake.
I love pancakes.
No, that's not what happened. He was devoured by a dragon, like a little snack.
Yeah, a snack for a giant.
Do you have any snacks?
You guys, he was clearly killed by a dragon.
No, what? He was obviously killed by a giant.
It was a dragon.
Oh my gosh,
A dragon.
Guys. Like, giants and dragons are huge and cool and stuff, and I'm sure a battle between those groups would be amazing, but you're missing the point. I am not dead.
What does he know?
Yeah, the guy's a lunatic.
Hey, this is Brandon Mull, and I am happy to be here with you today to talk about key elements of story. Ever since I was a little kid, I have liked to live in my head a lot. My parents would sometimes catch me playing alone in a room, just living out stuff in my mind. I hated being watched when they would catch me doing that because I knew it looked silly, and in my head, amazing things were happening, but no one could see that from the outside. And I remember when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that was the first book that taught me that a book could be this experience, this vicarious experience I could have, where I could kind of live a story along with the characters in a way that was different than a movie, where I kind of watched it from a distance. For some reason, because the story in a book was happening in my head, it felt so much more real, like I was a part of the story. Also, I found that once I had Narnia in my head, it became a place I could go if I wanted to make up my own adventures as a little boy. And that kind of daydreaming led me to gradually have stories in my mind. And the stories in my head got cooler than some of the books I'd read, cooler than some of the movies I'd seen, and I really wanted to share them with other people. And I realized, as I sat down to try to write my stories down for the first time, I realized I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote a couple pages down, and when I read it back to myself, it looked really weak compared to my favorite books. And it made me almost doubt the quality of my imagination, or doubt the inner life I'd had for so many years, because as I tried to express it in written form, it just wasn't coming across. And I realized, it took some time to realize, but I gradually realized that, no, the stories in my head were great. I just needed to learn how to communicate them, how to turn these stories into written scenes. And so I began paying attention to how my favorite authors built their scenes. I practiced building my own scenes, and I'm still working on getting better at that. But over time, I did get better, and there reached a point where I felt like I could communicate my stories one scene at a time. And I remember when I tried my first full-length novel. It was right after I graduated college. It was the story of a boy who crossed into another world by being swallowed by a hippo. The hippo's mouth was the gateway to a land called Lyrian. And I called the story The Other End of the Hippo. And I was writing it almost completely just for me, just a story that I wished existed. And that story never got published in that form, but eventually, after I wrote my Fablehaven books, I went back to that Other End of the Hippo story, and that became my Beyonders series. You know, and a lot of the ideas in that story were still really strong. But I literally rewrote that novel, every single word rewritten, like just started with a blank file and rewrote the whole novel because it needed a pretty serious rewrite. Over the course of writing that first novel, I realized that I did not know so many fundamental things about a story, things that I thought I intuitively understood. I didn't consciously understand what I was doing, what made a story, what made a novel. And so what I would like to share with you today is what I consider the key elements of story, 5 key things that I look to when I'm developing a story, and that help me understand what battle am I fighting as I try to write a book, as I try to organize these wild daydreams, these scenes I have in my mind, as I try to organize them into a story I can communicate. I found these 5 things to be vital. Now, you can find these things I'm going to talk about are not earth-shattering. I mean, these are principles any story writer thinks about. But hopefully the way that I think about them might be useful to you. What I can share with you that nobody else can is the process I use when I make up a story. And hopefully there'll be things in my process that will make sense to you and that you can incorporate. And if there's things in my process that make no sense to you or clash with what you like to do or how you like to do it, you know, you don't need to use it. But these are the principles that I've used to basically write all my books. And I will write a bunch more. I've written 20 novels so far. Fablehaven series, Dragon Watch series, 5 Kingdoms series. I created spirit animals for Scholastic. Candy Shop War books. I've written a bunch of novels, and there are these 5 things that I come back to over and over again when I'm trying to figure out what battle I'm fighting as I try to write a book. So the first key element of story I want to talk about is characters. Characters are so important to a story. If you don't have interesting characters, you don't have anyone for the reader to care about. Also, you don't have anyone for you to care about as the writer. I mean, the characters are everything. When I come back to a favorite story or a favorite show, primarily the reason is I'm interested in the characters. I want to see what happens to them. I want to spend more time with them. Kind of like in your life, as you make friends, you're partly choosing those friends because of their character, because of who they are, and because of there's something about them that draws you to them, right? And we want our characters in our books to draw the reader in. You can all think of books that you've read where you have been excited to get to know that character, or where you almost feel like you know the character really well. I remember realizing I felt like I knew Harry Potter better than I knew the guy that lived 2 houses down from me on my street. And I think it was true, because I'd spent more time with Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series than I had with the guy that lived 2 houses down. And maybe that says something about my connection with reality and my neighborhood. But it also says something about how powerful fictional connections can be. Part of our job as we make a character is to give the readers people to care about and people who are interesting. Also, when I'm developing my characters for a novel, I want characters who will be able to play off each other well. I want I don't want to see the same person repeated over and over. In fact, a story gets a lot more interesting to me when the characters don't get along or have to find their way to getting along, because that creates friction and trouble and makes the story more interesting. Scenes where everyone gets along and scenes where there's no trouble are almost not worth writing. You'll find that they're just usually pretty empty. And so the cast of characters I put into my book and how they will relate to each other is really important, creating characters who can play off each other in interesting ways. I want you to pause and think for a moment about how you get to know a character in a book. I think if you reflect, you will find that you get to know characters in books by the things that they think, the things that they say, the things that they do, the things that they choose. There's a little bit of physical description about the character sometimes. You learn about the character sometimes by how they react to other characters. But fundamentally, it's the way the characters think, if you're in their point of view and get to hear their thoughts, or if you're not in their point of view where you get to hear their thoughts. It's the things the characters say, the things the characters do, and the things the characters choose that will reveal them to you as a reader. And it's just like in life. How do you get to know people in a classroom, or how do you get to know your next door neighbor, or how do you get to know anyone? It's by paying attention to how they interact with you and what they say and what they do, and eventually you draw conclusions from that about who they are. As an author, you are in control of letting the reader see. I mean, you're picking the moments that the reader will see, that the reader will engage with each character. And by what you have the character say and choose and think and do or whatever in those moments, the reader will draw conclusions about the character and will either grow to care about them or not. You can make a character very interesting being both likable or unlikable. It's not that the character has to be likable. The character just has to feel interesting, right? More than anything. A character that we want to spend time with, where we want to see what this character is going to do. And the trick for you as the author is to know your character so well that you can be true to who they are and the things that they think and do and say and choose. As you're true to who that character is and the things that they think and say and do and choose, that character will gradually feel increasingly real to your reader. And if the character, often in a book, a character will learn something and change, well, we won't understand that change unless we understand who the character is to begin with, and unless that change feels motivated by the circumstances the character has to deal with and the choices the character makes in those circumstances. And so the first principle that I want you to think long and hard about when you're writing a story is, who are my characters, and really pause and make sure you know them well. Sometimes, now to be very real with you, I don't completely know my characters from top to bottom, every character, before I start writing. Part of what I discover about the character or learn about the character happens through the writing, right? Sometimes I'll take a character a certain direction in a scene and go, yeah, that's who this person is. Sometimes I'll be writing a character and they just feel really flat and I have to rewrite them, because it's usually because I don't have a sense, either instinctive or intellectually yet, who this person is. Once you know who they are, you can be true to who they are and what they think and do and say and choose. And that will really help that character come to life. For example, maybe like my character Seth in Fablehaven. What's the center of that character? What's the heart of that character? The heart of that character for me, as I was imagining him, was I pictured my brother Bryson, and sometimes likening your character to someone you really know, can be useful. I didn't want him to be exactly like my brother Bryson, but I wanted a certain element of my brother, which was that my brother was a recklessly curious kid. And that reckless curiosity, it wasn't malicious, it wasn't mean. It was just, but it would lead him to make all sorts of mistakes, and he could make the same mistake 10 different ways, because that curiosity was this hunger in him that he couldn't really quiet. And I thought, okay, well, let's have a recklessly curious kid who's otherwise a pretty good kid, but kind of funny, and he's got a heart. He cares about his sister, and he teases his sister, but he also cares about her, and fundamentally cares about her. But let's let that reckless curiosity be at his heart. And putting him into a secret wildlife park for magical creatures with that reckless curiosity as part of his core led to all sorts of interesting moments in book 1 of Fablehaven and throughout that series. And then I contrasted him against his sister, who was Kendra. And I made Kendra more cautious and more reasonable, the kind of kid you'd want as a babysitter. Where I kind of wanted the characters to be learning opposite lessons. I wanted Kendra to be learning there were times when she could and should take risks. And I wanted Seth to learn that there were times when risks were foolish and where he could and should maybe keep the rules and think a little bit before taking action. And by having those characters clash with their opposing personalities and having them kind of learn opposite lessons from each other, that was a dynamic that I felt really worked in Fablehaven. And another point I want to make about characters before I move on. Sometimes people ask me, how do you write, a main character who's a girl? Like right now, I'm a 46-year-old dude. How do I get away with trying to write a 13-year-old girl, right? We're supposed to write what we know. Well, how can I claim to know a 13-year-old girl? And my answer to that would be, I don't know everything about 13-year-old girls. If you said, hey, if you have a 13-year-old girl character, are you saying you know everything about 13-year-old girls? And no, I would be quick to admit, I don't know everything about 13-year-old girls, and 13-year-old girls don't know everything about 13-year-old girls. And that might sound like I'm teasing 13-year-old girls, but I'm not. It's true for any category of person. You can't know everything about 46-year-old guys. You can't know everything about, 8-year-old boys. There might be some things that they would have in common, being 8, being of a certain size or a certain mentality, but the reality is every 46-year-old guy is a different dude, just like every 13-year-old girl is a different girl. So my job isn't to understand everything about a 13-year-old girl. My job as a writer is to understand a 13-year-old girl, to understand my character, to understand Kendra, to know if I know who she is, then I can be true to her and bring her to life in my story. Sometimes as a writer, that means you want to be a little careful about the characters you choose to write. When you're a young kid, it might be harder to write an old wizard than it will be when you're middle-aged and you've had some more life experiences and you can bring that old wizard to life maybe a little more completely. And probably I could write that old wizard even better once I'm an old guy myself and I've had more experiences. I'm not saying you don't want to attempt. You can attempt any character you want to attempt, but the more you can get your head around the character, the better you can be true to who that character is supposed to be and what they think and do and say and choose. Okay, so I think I've beat that one to death, but character is so fundamental. Those are my thoughts on character and some things I think about when I create a character. Number 2, when I'm thinking about my story, I look at who are my characters, and next, what are their relationships? Just like in real life, the characters in your story will have relationships, just like you have relationships in your life. And those relationships can be just like any of the spectrum of relationships you experience in real life. Some of them could be family relationships. There could be relationships like teacher to student. There could be relationships like coworkers or people in the same classroom, people who are kind of stuck together even though they might not want to be together. They're working at the same company, or they're on the same mission, or they got drafted into the same army. There are old friendships. There are new friendships. Old friendships can be so interesting because there's a lot of history there. New friendships can be interesting because the characters are just discovering each other. There are frenemies, like friendships where you're not sure how good a friend they really are, right? There are just straight up enemies and rivals, and those are some of the most important relationships in life and in stories. There are relationships between a person and their animal. But just like how in real life you have relationships, as the characters have relationships with each other, they will matter more to each other and they will matter more to the reader. And so giving your characters interesting and complicated and hopefully fascinating relationships, when relationships get a little twisted, things get a little more interesting, like, Luke, I am your father, right? Like, that's more interesting than just an enemy, and it's more interesting than just a dad. Somehow, this guy that's like an arch enemy who's also your dad, that resonated so deep in viewers that we've remembered it for decades. We are trying to create relationships that will really make the characters come to life, because as the characters care about each other, they will matter more to the reader. And these first 2 things, characters and relationships, are what will bring life into your story. As your characters come to life, as the relationships come to life, your reader will have people to care about. And if those characters become real to the reader, you are in business. part of how the characters will become real to the reader is if the reader reacts to the characters. If your character says something legitimately funny and the reader laughs, guess what? That reader's not laughing at nothing. That reader is laughing at something that has now become real for them, or they wouldn't react that way. It's become the character or the moment portrayed has become real in their mind. Similarly, if a character gets frustrated or angry at a character, guess what? That character is coming to life for them because they're reacting in a genuine way. If you want the reader to feel anything except boredom, basically, right? As long as if the reader is angry, if the reader is scared, if the reader is delighted, if the reader is laughing, all these things mean the reader is reacting, the characters are coming to life for them, and that means that the reader will care what happens to the character. The third thing I think about when I am building a story, I have my characters, they have relationships, and now hopefully with those characters and relationships, the reader cares about the story people I have made up. And once they care about those story people, all I have to do is introduce trouble. And hopefully if the reader already cares about those characters, as I introduce trouble, they will care more and will be worried to see what is going to happen to these characters. Sometimes in English class they'll call this conflict, right? There's other words to use besides trouble. Sometimes people will say change, introduce change, because inherently change is troublesome. But I like the word trouble because it is so easy to get. It is just, and it speaks to the wide variety of things you can throw at your characters. What kind of trouble can we have in a story? Trouble can be great and small. Just like in life, there's so many types of trouble we can have, and all those same kinds of trouble can happen for the reader. Can happen to the characters that the reader can experience through those characters. Trouble in a book can be life and death. Trouble in a book can be that you forgot to study for a test, or you arrived late to work and have to make an explanation to your boss. Sometimes the kind of trouble where you arrive late to work and have to make an explanation to your boss feels even more real than you have to save someone from a life and death situation. Why? Because arriving late and having to explain why you arrived late is an experience we have all had. Not all of us have protected a metropolis from Godzilla, but all of us have probably at some point failed to study properly for a test, or have hurt somebody's feelings and had to figure out how to fix it. And so I love a book like Harry Potter, where the trouble is both great and small. If you pause and think about Harry Potter, which that series is the best-selling series in the history of publishing, like 500 million copies or something like that. There's a part of the reason I think it did so well was J.K. Rowling did a wonderful job introducing a wide variety of trouble to Harry's life. Not only was Harry Potter worried about protecting Hogwarts, not only was he worried about Voldemort trying to track him down and kill him, and trying to get some justice for Voldemort having killed his family, trying to protect the wizarding world from this enormous threat, right, of these evil wizards, and sometimes having to fight off monsters or magical creatures. But Harry Potter also had to worry about getting his homework done, and had to worry about how he would perform on his tests. And he had to worry about who he was going to invite to the dance. He had to worry about mean relatives who treated him poorly. And they treated him so poorly that it made us feel very sympathetic toward him, and really started, it's hard to not root for this poor kid that's stuck under the Dursley stairs, right? We watch Harry Potter go through trouble with his friends. Sometimes Hermione and Ron got along great with him, and sometimes they went through their own troubles. He had to deal with rivals at school, not necessarily arch enemies who were trying to kill him, but guys like Malfoy. I mean, maybe eventually Malfoy became a bigger threat, but at least in the start of the series, Malfoy is just kind of a typical bully, right? He's got to worry about the Quidditch Cup. He's got to worry about school sports. And there are parts in Harry Potter where I was more concerned if they would win their Quidditch match than I was about the bigger threat of Voldemort, because I got caught up in the excitement of the moment in a Quidditch game or something. That wide variety of trouble that J.K. Rowling showed to Harry Potter is just such a simple example, or such a powerful example, I guess. Not simple, because it was such a great series. But it's a powerful example of how a variety of trouble can really enrich a story. understanding the trouble in your story really can help you understand the shape of the story you're telling. If you want a longer story, you just add more trouble for the most part, and maybe add, a couple more characters. It's amazing how as you add characters to a story, it will swell up and expand on you. I sometimes have young writers ask me, how do you start a story? And one simple way to think it through is, well, who are my characters? Who's my main character? Or who are the main characters I want to follow? And where are they getting introduced to the trouble that will be the heart of the story? How does that trouble start to show up for them? And if you show them intersecting that trouble, you will be at the start of a story, because the story gets interesting when the trouble shows up. How do I finish my story? Well, the character has to work through the trouble. Either the character will overcome the trouble, or the trouble will overcome the character. And so thinking long and hard about all the problems that you're going to throw at your character will have a huge impact on how long the story is, because the story is the process of the character working through all the trouble. For me, that's where plot comes from, is just understanding who's my character, and then what trouble shows up, and given who the character is, how would they react, and that leads to my fourth thing that I think about. So characters, relationships, bring life into the story, then trouble hits, and the fourth thing I think about is the decisions the characters make once the trouble hits. So characters, relationships, trouble, decisions. The decisions made by the characters in the book should be the main thing that controls the outcome of the story. That will make it feel like you're watching a story where the characters are taking responsibility for their destiny, and it just feels more impactful when the characters are working hard to solve their problems, especially the character who you're spending the most time with, or through whose eyes you're watching the story. The decisions the character makes should be true to who the character is, right? I mean, if the character has assassin skills, then they might handle danger different than a character who's never been in a fight before, right? Sometimes when backed into a corner, anyone can fight. But does your character need to be back into a corner to fight, or will they go seek out that fight, right? Like these are things that have to do with who that character is. These 5 principles I'm going to talk about, or that I am talking about, all reinforce one another. Sometimes the trouble will come from who the character is and what their relationships are. A lot of trouble in a story may arise simply from what the character wants and having obstacles to what they want. And what the character wants comes down to who they are. It makes me think of a movie like Rudy, where the main character wanted to be on the Notre Dame football team. And he wanted it so badly that he made all these enormous sacrifices. And the climax of the movie was him just getting in for a couple of inconsequential plays in a Notre Dame football game. These plays did not determine the outcome of the game. They only meant a lot because it meant so much to the character to get into the game. And because that character had worked so hard and cared so much, by the time he gets into the game, at the end of the movie, though it's not consequential for Notre Dame winning or losing, as an audience member, you're like, Rudy, because it mattered so much to the character that outcome, that result, ends up hitting really strong for the reader. So your characters will make decisions based on the trouble that they get in. And when you are in life, when you face some trouble, you face a challenge, you make a decision, and then you have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences is the 5th thing I think about. So characters, relationships. And then to me, plot comes from a cycle of trouble, decisions, and consequences. When your character makes a decision based on the trouble they're in, consequences will follow. In life, you do not get to choose the consequences. When I was in high school, if I went up and asked a girl to a dance or on a date, I could choose to ask. That was within my power. That was my power to make a decision. I could not decide whether that girl would say yes or no. That was up to her. And I have had times when girls have said no, and I've had times when girls have said yes. And it can be crushing when a girl says no. And it can be so exciting when a girl says yes, and such a relief. And sometimes we try to hedge our bets and ask someone that we feel sure we know what the outcome will be. But I have asked girls where I thought I knew what the outcome would be, and they still said no. And I've also been mildly surprised when a girl has said yes, when I really wasn't sure which way that might go. And so it is like that in your books, where your characters will make decisions, but they don't get to control the consequences. Now, unlike life, where life will control the consequences for you, when you are writing a book, you, as the author, are in charge of the consequences. It is godlike power. But that godlike power has to be used honestly and responsibly if you want your story to feel real. When I say that, I mean, like, if a character makes a decision, the consequence ideally should usually be a consequence that the reader goes, yeah, given that problem and that character, I'll believe what just happened, right? Like, if the character gets saved by dumb luck all the time, you will eventually stop believing the story, because you know that in life we don't get saved by dumb luck too often. You know, you might get lucky once or twice, but if a character is lucky through a whole book, I mean, unless the book is about a magical luck charm or something, your reader will stop believing the story. And so, though you have power to control the consequences in your story, you also owe it to the reader to deal with those consequences in an honest way. It is so challenging to stay honest as we tell stories. And it is really hard to paint your characters into a difficult corner and then have them think and act and choose their way out in a way that feels plausible. And sometimes your characters might fail, especially if your book has a variety of trouble. I mean, I hope that they're failing at some things. If there's a main problem they're trying to solve, you know, a lot of us will be rooting for them to solve it, and we want to see them solve it. So hopefully you can figure out a way to help your character solve it. But if not, maybe the story is a tragedy. Maybe the characters don't overcome the trouble. Maybe the trouble overcomes the characters. But for me, plot comes from setting up a group of characters, introducing them to a bunch of trouble, and then as we watch them make decisions and deal with the consequences of those decisions, often when a character gets into trouble, they will make a decision, consequences will come, which will lead to new trouble and new decisions and new consequences. So they work through trouble, decisions, consequences over and over again until at the end of the day, your character has worked through all the main points of trouble that you have brought up. You know, the big trouble, the small trouble, the things you set up, hopefully you pay off. You know, you set up a bunch of trouble and we watch them work through the little things, and maybe the heroine saves the boy but loses her life, or maybe the heroine, you know, flunks out of school but succeeds in defeating the bad guy, or, you know, there's a million ways that they might succeed at some things and fail at others. But at the end of the day, we want to know, based on the trouble you set up, how'd the character do? Like, what did they succeed at? What did they fail at? And what did it look like? That was the story, was what it looked like as they worked through all their trouble. Did they defeat their enemy? Did they turn the enemy into a friend? Did the enemy win this round? All these are things that are in your control as a storyteller. This is 30 minutes. This concludes what I wanted to say here. Hopefully I gave you enough information that you can think of some questions you'd like to ask me. I'd be happy to take questions now for the next 15 minutes. And hopefully, if you remember nothing from this presentation, remember that if you get stuck writing a story, if you're not sure what to do next, or if you're getting stuck formulating a story, remember that you can go to those 5 basic questions. Who are my characters? What are their relationships? What trouble are they facing? What decisions will they make to overcome the trouble? And what consequences will flow from those decisions? And as you think through that over and over, that will help you create a shape or structure for your story. Thank you very much for your time. I am Brandon Mull, and I'm happy to take some questions. Okay, so yeah, question time. I've got a list of questions right here. From Shubangi Oja? Man, I probably butchered your name. Sorry about that. How did you write your first ever draft? And, you know, writing my first draft of something was so frustrating because it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. But the way I got that first draft written was having faith that I would improve and having faith that I wanted to try to tell stories. And so, you know, early on, you need to give yourself permission to not be at the same level as your favorite author. You need to give yourself permission to improve and realize that, for anyone to get good, it's going to take some, probably, unless you're a rare exception, it's going to take some lousy drafts. So give yourself permission to get better. You don't have to step onto the basketball court and be LeBron James on your first time playing. You can practice and get better and work your way up toward a high level, right? When was the first time I wrote a book is a question from Farouk Khan. And I first wrote a book as a kid. I mean, I was just practicing as a kid. And I like the thought that you can write a book when you're young and you can write a book when you're old. And the way you get good at it is do it. And there's no age limit to writing a good book. You can write a great book at 15. You can write a great book at 50. And partly that's going to have to do with how much time have you put into it. From Chloe Martin, I've got, how do you create characters that you might disagree with, either morally or in the way that they think about their situations? And to me, that's at the heart of creating characters, is creating characters that would do things differently than how I would. Now, some of my characters might share some of my thoughts or some of my morality or some of my biases, but if all of my characters think like I do, then you'll feel like you're reading the same person over and over. And also, how am I going to make, I'm not a megalomaniac who wants to take over the world, and I don't want to cause people harm. And yet I write villains inside my story who have very different morality from me. And so I try to think of interesting people that have their own reasons for why they would want to do those things and stay true to that person. Kind of like I'm doing a puppet show, right? Like I have to learn who this puppet is and who that puppet is and be true to who those puppets are as they speak. They're not speaking for me. Hopefully they're speaking for themselves. And I'm creating the illusion of a bunch of different people. And part of what will help sustain that illusion is if some of those people think very differently from me. And that can be hard to do because we're used to going through life thinking like ourselves. People that have advantages at this kind of thinking are people who do like improv, right? Where they put on a character for a scene or for a skit. Or people who write other characters and develop the empathy to look at life from different points of view. A nice thing about writing characters who are different than you is it will teach you to look at life in new ways and fresh ways. And I find value there as a writer. Sometimes I learn about points of view I don't have as I try to inhabit those point of view to create a character. I have a question from Barira Zafar, who says, I'm currently participating in NaNoWriMo, and I've been having trouble reaching my daily word count goal. How do you motivate yourself to keep writing when you feel like everything you put on the page is complete garbage? It can be hard to stay motivated. If you're not excited about the story that you're writing, I'd say it's almost impossible to stay motivated. So for me, it starts with, do I care about the story I'm telling? Am I telling a story that matters to me? Do these characters matter to me? And then I trust that if it really matters to me, eventually I can make it matter to the reader if I can just tell the story in the right way. And so it's really spending enough time telling stories that you can really find what kind of stories you're passionate about, and that will help pull you through. You also have to give yourself permission to write a lousy first draft, right? Like it doesn't have to be pure gold. You don't have to be spinning straw into gold on your first shot. And as you give yourself permission to not make every scene perfect, that can help you stay moving and realizing that a big part of writing is rewriting, and that as you produce a good story, you can then go back and figure out which scenes were essential or which scenes were not well written. And you have all the time in the world to rewrite. Rewriting really is like a superpower, because think about a situation. If someone says something mean to you, and then you think up a comeback like a half an hour later, right? Like, so often in the moment that comeback doesn't come right when you need it. But when you're writing, you have that half an hour to think up that comeback. In fact, you have days to think up that comeback. You can brainstorm with your friends about the perfect comeback. And then if you want the character to be really witty and clever, you can put that perfect comeback right into the story as if it happened instantaneously. And so remember that stay motivated partly because if you have a story that you feel like is worth telling, remember you have a lot of time to get better and to improve that story. And what's key is that you keep moving so that there's a story to improve. Does that make sense? This is Amanda French. I loved Five Kingdoms. It was so good. How did you come up with all the different kingdoms? So Five Kingdoms is kind of my master class in world building so far. It's probably the most complex world I've created. A place called the Outskirts, separate from our world, where it's divided into 5 different kingdoms. Each kingdom has different magic that works there. And basically each kingdom is different from the others, and the magic of one kingdom doesn't transfer to the other. So it's sort of 5 fantasy worlds in one. An example would be there's a kingdom called Zeropolis, where magic has been used to develop advanced technology. And that advanced technology only works in Zeropolis. So how did I come up with those complexities? Well, a massive amount of planning and daydreaming. It so happens that I love making up worlds. I love making up situations where reality works a little different from how it works for us. That's why I write fantasy so much. And so for me, where did all this stuff in Five Kingdoms come from? A massive amount of time, a big effort to take my characters places I hadn't seen before, the way I was doing it, and a desire to create a huge amount of variety in one series. And I wanted that even the fact that there were 5 different kingdoms, I wanted that to make sense. I wanted that to have its own logic. And so I guess I could just say a massive amount of thought was what made that possible. Thought and planning. Patricia Americani says, how do you make troubles and characters complex without getting lost and losing focus? Yeah, you don't want to make it, you're right, that you can make things so complex that it becomes incomprehensible, or you can get lost in the minutiae or the details. And so it is about understanding what's most important, what you most want to come across. I think it becomes really having laser focus on what characters are important in this story, what is the trouble that's going to matter to this story. And I think as we kind of stay on target with that, it helps us from going astray. So that comes back to those 5 fundamentals for me. Is if I know the characters we're going to be spending time with well, if I kind of know their strengths and weaknesses, if I know what they want to achieve, if I'm communicating what they want to achieve to the reader, if I understand what obstacles are between them and what they want to achieve, that helps me not let it sprawl down roads that have nothing to do with the core of my story, because the core of my story are those main characters and their main trouble. That's not a complete answer to your question, right? It's a complicated question. That's as close as I can come, right now. We only have about 2 minutes left. Someone is asking, where do you start when creating a character? When creating a character, it just totally depends. Sometimes I start by relating them to someone I know. Sometimes I start with thinking of the dynamics that I need in the story. Like, I think if I've got this character, then I need a character who will bother or frustrate that character. So sometimes I'm creating characters because I know a need that the story has, or if I know a character needs a mentor, I'm thinking, well, who would that person consider a mentor? Who would they be willing to be taught by? But like, I think it's some of the core attributes of who they are the places I usually start. But sometimes I see it like a movie in my mind, and characters just spring into being, and I think, oh, I see this guy swinging on a rope with a sword, and like, okay, well, how does that come to be? How did that guy get there? Who is he, and why would he take that risk, and et cetera, et cetera. I'll make this the last question because I know I'm almost out of time. Byron McLean says, how do you come up with a satisfying and interesting ending? You're at the end of the story because you've worked through the trouble. What will make it satisfying and interesting is if you've done the work to set it up so that the reader knows what the character is trying to accomplish, the reader understands the obstacles. And if the character can overcome those obstacles in ways that are satisfying, if you can surpass their expectations, or at least meet their expectations, that will feel like a satisfying ending. I like the quote that the perfect ending is both unpredictable and inevitable. if it could fit that statement, you'll have a killer ending. Guys, we're out of time. I appreciate you asking some questions and listening to me. There's a whole lot more conference left. If you want to see details of how I work, check out my books and see what I look like as I spin a story. And you can check out my website at brandonmull.com. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.